November 24th, 1944. Thanksgiving morning in West Texas. The bacon
Attention, roll
sizzled in the
call. Where
cast iron
cooperation
skillet.
ensures fair treatment.
Each strip curled at
Dismissed.
the
Back to
edges as
quarters.
the fat rendered into liquid gold. Steam rose in delicate spirals. The grease popped and hissed against the black metal, sending up that unmistakable aroma that every American man over 60 remembers from his childhood kitchen. Salt, smoke, home. But for the 47 German women prisoners standing in formation outside the mess hall, that smell meant something else entirely. It meant everything they had been taught about America was about to be tested, everything they believed about their enemy, everything they thought they knew about who they were. Maggie Schneider was 24 years old. Dirt streaked her left cheek. Her gray prison uniform had faded from 3 months under the merciless Texas sun. She stood rigid in formation, trying not to breathe too deeply, trying not to let that bacon smell get inside her head. But it was already too late. Her stomach growled, her mouth watered, and somewhere deep in her chest, something she had buried for 3 years of war began to crack open. For 3 years, Nazi propaganda had told her that American food was disgusting, that American people were weak and decadent, that American values were nothing but lies wrapped in a flag. She had believed it, or at least she had tried to believe it, because belief was easier than doubt. Certainty was safer than questions. But when Maggie Schneider smelled that bacon for the first time, when she saw the American Cowboys moving through the mess hall with platters piled high with food she could not even name, when she felt the November wind carrying scents that made her remember what it felt like to be human, instead of just a soldier, just a prisoner, just a number in a war that had already taken everything from her, everything changed. This is the story of how one Thanksgiving dinner changed 47 lives forever, how Texas cowboys taught German soldiers what America really means, and how 20 years later, enemies gathered around that same table as family. 24 hours earlier, the announcement had come during evening roll call. The desert wind whipped through the compound, kicking up red dust that stung eyes and coated throats. The sun hung low on the horizon, turning the western sky orange and purple. November in West Texas meant cool mornings and tolerable afternoons, but the evenings still carried warmth from the day's heat, radiating up from the baked earth. 47 women stood in neat rows wearing faded gray Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms. They had learned to expect the unexpected in this strange American facility that felt more like a working ranch than a prison camp. Cowboys served as guards. Horses grazed in corrals. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, dotted with scrub brush and rocky outcroppings that shimmered in the fading light. Colonel Thomas Bennett stood before them. He was 46 years old, with a weathered face that spoke of decades in the Texas sun. His campaign hat sat square on his head. His uniform was pressed, but his boots showed the dust and wear of a man who actually worked for a living. He was not the brutal prison commandant they had been taught to expect. He was something else entirely, something that confused them. He began to speak. The interpreter, a nervous young private from Houston, translated his words into German. Ladies, tomorrow is Thanksgiving Day, an important American holiday. My staff and I would like to invite you to join us for a traditional Thanksgiving feast. The words hung in the cooling desert air like an impossible dream. Several women glanced at each other. Confusion flickered across faces, suspicion tightened jaws. Maggie felt her heart begin to race. She understood enough English to know she had heard correctly. But understanding the words and believing them were entirely different matters. Captain Helena Braun stood at the front of the formation. At 38, she was the highest-ranking woman among the prisoners. Her spine was rigid. Her face was a mask of barely concealed outrage. When she spoke, her voice cut through the silence like a knife. This is a test. They want to see which of us will fraternize with the enemy. We must refuse. But Maggie noticed something Captain Braun had missed. She saw the way the American guard stood, relaxed but respectful. She saw Colonel Bennett's eyes. They showed genuine invitation rather than mockery. She had been in this camp for 3 months, and nothing about these peculiar American cowboys had matched what she had been taught to expect. Sergeant Buck Calloway stepped forward. Everyone called him Buck. He was 29 years old, tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and the easy confidence of a man who had spent more time on horseback than in military formation. His Stetson was weathered, his boots were scuffed, his hands showed calluses from real work. "Colonel," he said in his slow Texas drawl, Maybe the ladies need some time to think on it. Big decision and all. Colonel Bennett nodded. You have until tomorrow morning to decide. Anyone who wishes to join us will be welcome. Anyone who prefers to remain in quarters will not be judged or punished. This is an invitation, not an order. As the women were dismissed, they walked back to their barracks in small groups, speaking in urgent whispers. Maggie found herself walking alone, her mind churning with questions she had no answers for. What was Colonel Bennett really planning? Was this genuine kindness or sophisticated psychological warfare? And why did the thought of accepting terrify her more than the thought of refusing? If you or someone you know served during World War II, whether in Europe, the Pacific, or here at home, this story will mean something special. Stay with us. And when this is over, I want to hear your stories in the comments below. You are about to hear how one Thanksgiving dinner changed 47 lives forever. How Texas Cowboys taught German soldiers what America really means. And how 20 years later, again, enemies gathered around that same table as family. But first, you need to understand how Maggie Schneider ended up in West Texas in the first place. Because her journey from Berlin to this desert prison camp is a story that millions of men and women lived during those terrible years. A story of being caught up in something bigger than yourself, of losing everything you knew, of having to rebuild yourself from nothing. 3 months earlier, August 1944, the transport truck rattled to a stop in front of a cluster of low wooden buildings that shimmered in waves of heat. Maggie stepped down onto Texas soil for the first time, and the heat hit her like a physical blow. She had grown up in Berlin with its cool forests and mountain breezes. Summer in Berlin meant 25 degrees Celsius on a hot day. This was 43 degrees Celsius, 109 Fahrenheit, the kind of heat that makes your lungs burn with each breath, the kind of heat that makes you understand why people go mad in the desert. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction. No trees, no green, just scrub brush and rust-colored rocks and dust devils spinning across flats that looked like they went on forever. And the sky. Dear God, the sky. In Berlin, buildings blocked the horizon. Here, the sky was so blue it hurt to look at, so vast it made her feel like an ant crawling across an infinite plain. Maggie had been born in 1920 to middle-class parents in Berlin. Her father worked at the Central Post Office. Her mother took in sewing to earn extra money. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives until history swallowed them whole. In 1942, at 22 years old, Maggie had been drafted into the Wehrmacht as a radio operator. She had not wanted to go, but wanting had nothing to do with it. You went where you were told. You did what you were ordered. You believed what you were taught, because the alternative was unthinkable. She had been captured outside Paris in May 1944 during the chaotic retreat from France, processed through England, shipped across the Atlantic in the hold of a transport vessel where the smell of vomit and fear never faded. Each step of the journey had taken her further from everything she knew, further from home, further from the person she used to be. Now she stood in West Texas, surrounded by 26 other German women auxiliaries, all of them sweating through their gray uniforms, all of them trying to understand how they had ended up in this alien landscape that looked like the surface of Mars. A tall American officer approached. Maggie instinctively straightened her spine, preparing for harsh commands. But instead of shouting, he removed his hat in a gesture that seemed almost courteous. Welcome to Fort Stockton. I am Colonel Bennett. This facility was a working cattle ranch before the war, and it still is in many ways. You will be housed in the converted bunkhouses, and you will be expected to work. But you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. His words were translated by the nervous young private. Maggie listened with her head tilted, trying to understand the English beneath the German translation. She had studied English in school. Not much. Enough to recognize some words. Enough to know that the translation was accurate. Enough to wonder why an American officer would remove his hat when speaking to enemy prisoners. They were led past corrals where horses watched them with mild curiosity. American soldiers in uniforms that seemed strangely casual moved about their duties. Several wore cowboy hats instead of standard military caps. One was repairing a fence with the easy competence of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. This was supposed to be a prison camp. It looked like a ranch that happened to have some soldiers living on it. The barracks was a long wooden building that smelled of pine and dust. Each woman was assigned a narrow bed with clean sheets, a footlocker, and a small window that looked out over the desert. It was sparse, but it was surprisingly clean. Nothing like the horror stories they had been told about American prison camps. Nothing like what she had expected at all. That first evening, as the women gathered uncertainly in their new quarters, they heard music drifting from somewhere outside. Not military marches. Something else. Something with guitars and a mournful quality that spoke of loneliness in wide open spaces. Maggie moved to her window and looked out. The sun had set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that she had never seen in Berlin. Several American guards sat around a small fire. One played guitar while others listened. They looked young, tired, as far from home as she was. One of them caught her watching. Instead of shouting at her to get away from the window, he simply nodded in greeting before returning his attention to the music. That small gesture confused her more than anger would have. She was the enemy. She was a prisoner. She should be despised. Instead, this American boy had nodded at her like she was just another person watching the sunset. Anna Klein occupied the bunk next to Maggie's. She was 26 years old, a nurse from Hamburg, with kind eyes and steady hands. She whispered in the gathering darkness. They are not what we were told, they are just boys. Farm boys and cowboys. Maggie pressed her forehead against the warm glass and watched the fire flicker in the gathering darkness. She had expected enemies. She had found something far more confusing. She had found people. The next morning began Maggie's second week at the camp. Sergeant Buck Calloway appeared in the doorway of the quartermaster's shed where Maggie had been assigned to sort supplies. He was backlit by the harsh morning sun, his Stetson creating a shadow that fell across the dusty floor. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Colonel says you speak some English." That true, Maggie nodded cautiously. "I study in school. Not so good, but some." Buck's weathered face creased into what might have been approval. "Well, that's more than most folks around here speak German. How do you feel about helping translate when needed? Make things easier for everybody." It was phrased as a question, not an order. That small courtesy caught Maggie off guard. In the Wehrmacht, no one had asked how she felt about anything. Orders were given, orders were obeyed, feelings were irrelevant. "I can try," she managed. Over the following weeks, Maggie found herself serving as an informal bridge between the German prisoners and their American captors. Buck would explain work assignments, camp rules, or practical matters, and she would translate for the other women. But something else began to happen during these exchanges. Buck started teaching her things that had nothing to do with prison camp regulations. One afternoon in September, they were walking the fence line checking for damage when Buck stopped and pointed to a stubby green growth near a post. "See that plant there? That's prickly pear cactus. Looks mean, but if you know how to handle it, you can eat the fruit. Desert's full of things like that. Looks hostile till you understand it." Maggie wondered if he was talking about more than just plants. She studied the cactus with its fierce spines protecting something potentially nourishing underneath. The metaphor was not lost on her. Nothing Buck Calloway said was ever quite as simple as it seemed. He taught her cowboy wisdom in his slow, patient drawl, how to read the sky for coming weather, which snakes to avoid and which were harmless, how a good horse could sense a person's character better than most people could. These lessons felt subversive somehow, as if learning to survive in this desert landscape was a kind of betrayal of her German identity. "Why do you teach me these things?" she asked him one day, her English improving with practice. Buck considered the question while rolling a cigarette with practiced fingers. "My daddy always said that knowledge is the one thing nobody can take from you. War won't last forever, Miss Schneider. Might as well learn something useful while you are here." It was the first time anyone had suggested she might have a future beyond the war. The possibility opened inside her like those desert flowers Buck had shown her, the ones that bloomed after rain in the most unlikely places. September rolled into early autumn. The heat became bearable. The work continued. And every Sunday, something remarkable happened in the mess hall. Mrs. Rose Martinez was 64 years old. She had been cooking at this ranch since before it became a prison camp. She was a tiny woman with weathered brown skin and eyes that seemed to see through pretense. Her grandfather had come to Texas when it was still Mexico. Her family had been feeding cowboys and ranch hands for 3 generations. She treated everyone the same, prisoner and guard alike, because in her kitchen there was only one rule that mattered: nobody goes hungry. On Sunday mornings, Mrs. Rose cooked what she called proper breakfast. And that meant bacon. The first Sunday in September, Maggie walked into the mess hall and stopped dead in her tracks. The smell hit her like a wave. Bacon. Not the paper-thin European bacon she remembered from before the war. Thick-cut American bacon, crisped in cast iron until the edges curled and the fat rendered into liquid gold. But there was more. Scrambled eggs, fluffy, and butter yellow, still steaming on the serving line. Hash brown shredded potatoes fried crispy on the outside and tender inside. Biscuits the size of baseballs with butter melting into them. Coffee so strong you could stand a spoon in it. Maggie had been eating prison rations for 4 months. Thin soup, hard bread, occasional potato. Her stomach had adapted to constant mild hunger. But this was something else entirely. She took her tray and sat at the long table with the other women. The bacon lay on her plate, still warm, grease glistening. She stared at it. 3 years of propaganda echoed in her head. American food is disgusting. Americans want to poison you. Do not trust anything they give you. But the smell. God, the smell. Mrs. Rose Martinez appeared at her shoulder like a short, round guardian angel. Mija, you gonna stare at it or eat it? Bacon don't bite back. Maggie picked up one strip. It was still warm. The grease coated her fingers. She took the smallest bite, prepared for it to taste wrong, to taste like propaganda had promised. Salt, fat, smoke, crispy and tender at once. It tasted like comfort, like home should taste if home still existed, like everything she had been missing for 3 years of war. She started crying, right there in the mess hall over a piece of bacon. Tears ran down her cheeks and dripped onto her tray. She could not stop them, could not explain them, could only taste salt from the bacon mixing with salt from her tears. Mrs. Rose sat down beside her and put one small, strong hand on Maggie's shoulder. That's right, honey. You cry. Ain't nothing wrong with crying over good food. Means you're still human. Around the table, other women were having similar experiences. Anna Klein bit into a biscuit and closed her eyes. Ava Fisher tasted the eggs and made a small sound of surprise and pleasure. Even Captain Braun, who sat rigid and disapproving at the end of the table, ate every bite on her plate with the focused intensity of someone who had forgotten what real food tasted like. If they lied about the bacon, Maggie thought, what else did they lie about? That question would not leave her alone. It followed her through September. Through October, when they worked the cotton harvest, and her hands bled until Buck gave her his sister's work gloves. Through November, when the invitation came, and the camp divided into those who would attend the feast and those who would refuse. Because propaganda is powerful. It shapes what you see. It colors what you believe. It builds walls in your mind that are harder to break than walls made of stone. But sometimes a single experience can crack those walls. A cowboy treating you with respect. A cook showing you kindness. A piece of bacon that tastes like home. And once those cracks appear, doubt seeps in. Questions multiply. And the walls that seemed so solid begin to crumble. November 23rd, 1944. Evening roll call. The wind whipped through the compound. 47 women in faded gray uniforms stood in formation. Colonel Bennett made his announcement. Captain Braun declared it a trap. And Maggie Schneider stood there in the gathering darkness, trying to decide who she was going to be. Would she cling to the propaganda that had already proven false? Would she refuse the invitation out of loyalty to a Germany that seemed further away every day? Or would she walk through those mess hall doors tomorrow and choose to see what was real instead of what she had been told was real? That night, the barracks erupted in heated debate. 24 hours until Thanksgiving. 24 hours to choose between the past and something new. 24 hours to decide if enemies could sit at the same table. Captain Braun stood in the center of the barracks, her military bearings still intact despite months of captivity. This is psychological warfare. They want to identify the weak among us. Anyone who accepts this invitation shames herself and dishonors Germany. Several women nodded in agreement. The older prisoners, those who had been more deeply indoctrinated, those who had more to lose by admitting they might have been wrong about everything. But Anna Klein spoke up, her voice hesitant but firm. What if it is genuine? These Americans have treated us fairly. Better than fairly if we are honest. That's exactly their strategy, Braun snapped back. They soften you with kindness so you will forget who you are. They want to break your spirit. Maggie sat on her bunk listening to the arguments swirl around her. Her hands still bore the calluses from weeks of harvest work. She thought about Buck's patient teaching, Mrs. Rose's equal portions of stew at every meal, Colonel Bennett's consistent fairness. Were those calculated manipulations or simple human decency? She honestly did not know anymore. "What do you think?" Eva Fisher whispered. She was 22, the youngest of them all, sleeping in the bunk above Maggie's. "Will you go?" "I don't know," Maggie admitted. "Part of me wants to. Part of me is terrified of what it might mean." The debate continued for 3 days. Morning arguments, evening discussions, whispered conversations in the dark. The camp became divided between those who would attend, those who would refuse, and those still agonizing over the decision. Buck noticed the tension immediately. He approached Maggie during her morning work assignment with characteristic directness. "Your friends seem pretty wound up about this dinner invitation." Maggie struggled to find the English words for her conflicted feelings. "It is difficult. To accept feels like betrayal, but to refuse feels like," she paused, searching, "like refusing to see truth." "What truth is that?" Buck asked, genuinely curious. "That maybe enemies can sit at same table. That maybe war does not change everything about who we are as people." Her English was improving rapidly, shaped by necessity and these daily conversations. Buck nodded slowly, looking out over the desert landscape that had become as familiar to him as his own face. "My granddaddy fought in the Spanish-American War. Hated the Spanish with a passion during those years. After the war ended, he ended up working on a ranch owned by a man from Cuba. Became best friends. He used to say that war makes us into things we are not, and peace gives us the chance to remember who we really are." That night, Maggie sat at her window watching the stars come out. The same stars that hung over Berlin. The same stars that would hang over whatever came next. Tomorrow morning, she would have to make a choice. 28 women would choose to attend. 19 would refuse. And everything would change. Because sometimes the most important decisions are not about loyalty or betrayal. Sometimes they are simply about having the courage to see what is real, to taste the bacon, to accept the invitation, to sit at a table with people you were taught to hate and discover they are just people after all. Tomorrow was Thanksgiving. The Cowboys had invited them to feast. And Maggie Schneider was about to learn that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say yes to an impossible kindness. November 24th, 1944. Thanksgiving morning, 28 women stood in the pale dawn light, dressed in their cleanest uniforms. They had spent the previous hour helping each other prepare, braiding hair, smoothing wrinkles from gray fabric that had seen too many washings, buttoning buttons with trembling fingers. Small acts of care that felt like armor against what was coming. In the other half of the barracks, 19 women sat in stony silence. Captain Braun among them, her face a mask of disapproval. They watched their fellow prisoners prepare to attend the feast with expressions that ranged from disgust to something that might have been envy, though none would admit it. The walk from the barracks to the mess hall felt like walking to execution or wedding, impossible to tell which. Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs. Her mouth was dry. Ina Klein walked beside her, gripping her hands so tightly it hurt. Eva Fisher followed just behind, her young face pale with fear and anticipation. The morning air was cool and crisp. The sky stretched overhead in that impossible Texas blue that still took Maggie's breath away after 3 months. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied. The sound of pots clanging came from the mess hall, and underneath it all, barely perceptible but unmistakable, the smell of roasting turkey. Mrs. Rose Martinez had been cooking since before dawn. She had commandeered every able body in the kitchen. 4 20-pound turkeys turned golden brown in the ovens. Pots of mashed potatoes sat ready on the stove. Cranberry sauce gleamed ruby red in serving bowls. The pies made the day before lined every available counter. Apple, pumpkin, pecan. The accumulated labor of love from a woman who believed that food was the universal language of kindness. Colonel Bennett stood at the entrance to the mess hall in his formal uniform. His weathered face showed nothing but quiet welcome as the 28 women approached. He removed his hat. "Welcome, ladies. We are honored to have you join us." The interpreter translated, but Maggie barely heard. She was staring past the colonel into the transformed mess hall beyond. White tablecloths covered the long tables. Real tablecloths, not the usual bare wood. They had been stored away in some ranch house attic, waiting for special occasions. Fall decorations made from dried corn stalks and colored leaves created splashes of orange and yellow and red. Small pumpkins sat at intervals down each table. Candles flickered in glass holders, technically against regulations, but Mrs. Rose had insisted, and Colonel Bennett had decided that some rules were worth breaking. And the smell. Dear God, the smell. It hit them like a wave of sense memory from a time before war. Turkey roasting with sage and thyme, bread baking, butter melting, sugar caramelizing on a sweet potato casserole. The yeasty richness of fresh rolls, coffee percolating in enormous pots, cinnamon and nutmeg and clove from the pies. Maggie felt her knees go weak. She had not smelled anything like this since before the war, since her mother's kitchen in Berlin when she was still a girl who believed the world made sense. The seating arrangement had been carefully considered. No separation between prisoners and guards. Americans and Germans mixed at every table. The message was clear. For these few hours, there were no enemies, only people sharing a meal. Maggie found herself seated between Buck Calloway on her right and Private Danny O'Brien on her left. Danny was 20 years old, fresh-faced and homesick from County Cork originally. Across the table sat Mrs. Rose Martinez herself, her dark eyes warm with something that looked like grandmotherly affection. Anna Klein sat diagonal, her nurse's hands folded carefully on the white cloth. Buck looked uncomfortable in his pressed shirt and tie. He caught Maggie's eye and gave her a small, reassuring nod. She felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Whatever was about to happen, at least she was not facing it alone. Colonel Bennett stood at the head of the main table. The room fell silent. Even the kitchen noises ceased. 53 people, American and German guard, and prisoner, cowboy and soldier, waited. We give thanks today for many things. For this food that Mrs. Martinez and her kitchen crew have prepared. For the hope that this terrible war is drawing closer to its end. For the reminder that even in the darkest times, we can choose to see each other as human beings first and enemies second. Welcome to our table. The interpreter translated, her voice shaking slightly with emotion. Then Colonel Bennett sat down and servers began bringing out the food. Platters appeared as if by magic. Turkey carved into thick slices, the skin crackling and golden. Stuffing bread cubes mixed with sage and onions, and celery baked until the top was crispy. Mashed potatoes whipped with butter and cream until they were clouds. Cranberry sauce, both jellied and wholeberry. Sweet potato casserole topped with pecans, and brown sugar and miniature marshmallows. Green bean casserole with crispy fried onions. Fresh baked rolls, still steaming, butter melting into them before they even reached the tables. Gravy and boats that seemed bottomless. The German women stared. They had never seen this much food in one place. Even before the war, even in the best times, meals had been simpler, smaller, more austere. This was abundance on a scale that seemed almost obscene, almost American. The platters were passed in awkward silence. Hands reached tentatively. Portions were taken with uncertainty. The women looked at each other with expressions that asked the same question. Is this real? Are we really allowed to eat this, Mrs. Rose Martinez watched from her position across from Maggie. She saw the hesitation, the confusion, the suspicion that this might all be some elaborate trick. She had seen it before, that look in the eyes of people who have been hungry for too long, who have forgotten what it feels like to have enough. She pointed to each dish with her gnarled finger, her Spanish accented English, warm and matter of fact. This red stuff is cranberry sauce. Sweet and sour together. Americans put it with turkey. Don't ask me why, we just do. Try it. This orange mush, sweet potatoes with marshmallows on top. I know it looks crazy. My grandmother would have thought so too. But it tastes good. This is stuffing. Bread with herbs cooked inside the turkey. Takes on all the flavor of the bird. And this, she pointed to a pie at the end of the table. This is the real test. Pumpkin pie. If you can eat pumpkin pie without making a face, you might just have a future in America. Her tone was so practical, so grandmotherly, so completely without judgment, that something in the room shifted. The tension did not disappear, but it eased slightly. Shoulders dropped an inch. Breathing became less shallow. Maggie picked up her fork. The turkey sat on her plate, steam still rising from it. She cut a small piece. The meat was so tender it fell apart under the pressure of her fork. She lifted it to her mouth. The first taste was a revelation. This was nothing like the tough, dry chicken they had occasionally gotten in Wehrmacht mess halls. This turkey was juicy, tender, seasoned with herbs she could not quite identify, but that tasted like comfort and safety and home. The skin crackled between her teeth, salty and perfectly crisped. She tried the mashed potatoes. Butter and cream and salt whipped until they were impossibly smooth, melting on her tongue like clouds made edible. The cranberry sauce was tart and sweet, at once cutting through the richness of the other flavors. The stuffing was savory and herbal, each bite revealing new textures, new tastes. She ate slowly, methodically, trying each dish in turn. Around her, other women were doing the same. The silence at the table was no longer awkward. It was the silence of concentration, of people who have been hungry discovering what it feels like to have enough. Private Danny O'Brien cleared his throat. His Irish accent was thick with homesickness. Last Thanksgiving, I was in County Cork with my ma and 7 siblings. Ma made this turkey. He laughed a sound both sad and fond, burned it black as coal, dry as leather. We ate it anyway and told her it was grand. I miss her something fierce. The simple honesty of it broke something open. Anna Klein began to speak in German, and Maggie translated. Anna says in Hamburg they have Ernte Dankfest, Harvest Thanksgiving. Her grandmother made apple strudel every year. The whole house smelled like cinnamon for days. Her voice caught. The house is gone now, bombed, but she still remembers that smell. Buck spoke quietly, his Texas drawl slower than usual. My sister always burned the rolls, every single year, burned them black as Danny's ma's turkey, but she refused to admit they were anything less than perfect. We'd sit there choking down charcoal and telling her they were the best rolls we ever tasted, because that's what family does. Around the tables, conversations began to bloom like those impossible desert flowers after rain. Tentative at first, then stronger. Stories about harvest time, about family traditions, about the small rituals that make a house a home. The food kept coming. Mrs. Rose's kitchen crew moved like a well-oiled machine, replacing empty platters with full ones, refilling coffee cups, making sure no one's plate stayed empty for long. And then the pies appeared. Maggie had never seen a pumpkin pie before. She stared at the orange filling and its flaky crust topped with a dollop of fresh whipped cream. It looked strange, alien, but the smell was intoxicating. Cinnamon and nutmeg and clove and something else she could not name, but that smelled like autumn should smell if autumn were kind. She took a small bite. The filling was smooth and sweet and spiced. The crust was buttery and flaked apart in her mouth. The whipped cream added richness and a slight tang, and suddenly, without warning, she was crying. Not quiet tears, sobbing. Her fork clattered to her plate. Her shoulders shook. Tears ran down her face and dripped onto the white tablecloth. Around her, people froze. Buck half rose from his seat, concern written across his weathered face. "Ma'am, you all right?" Maggie could not speak, could not explain. How could she put into words that this pie tasted like safety, like a childhood she had lost, like a future she had not known she wanted? How could she explain that for 3 years she had been hard, enclosed and armored against feeling anything, and this one bite of pumpkin pie with its impossible sweetness had cracked her open? "It tastes like home should taste," she finally managed in German, and Anna translated through her own tears. Like safety, like maybe the war doesn't have to be everything. Mrs. Rose reached across the table and took Maggie's hand. Her grip was warm and strong and utterly without judgment. "Oh, honey, you eat, you cry, you do both. That's what Thanksgiving is for. That's what food is for, to remind us we're still human." The dam broke. Around the tables, women began to cry. Not all of them, but enough. Anna sobbed into her napkin. Eva made small hiccuping sounds as she tried to eat and weep at the same time. Even some of the American soldiers got misty-eyed, whether from the emotion of the moment or their own memories of home, it was impossible to say. But the crying was not sad, or rather it was hot and relieved and grateful all at once. It was the crying of people who have been holding themselves together for too long, finally allowing themselves to fall apart in a place that felt safe enough to do so. The feast continued. 4 hours it lasted, from noon until 4 in the afternoon. The initial awkwardness gave way to something warmer, more natural. People discovered that despite different languages and different uniforms, they had more in common than they had differences. An American soldier from Nebraska talked about his family's farm. A German woman from Bavaria described her father's apple orchard. They discovered they knew the same rhythms of harvest, the same gratitude for good weather, the same fear of drought and pest, and all the things that threaten those who depend on the land. Buck asked if they had harvest songs in Germany. Anna began to hum a melody old and simple. The other German women joined in singing softly in their native language, about bringing in the grain, about thanking God for provision, about the cycle of planting and reaping that connects all people who work the earth. Mrs. Rose's face lit up with recognition. I know that tune. My grandmother sang it. Spanish words, same melody. She began to sing in Spanish, her voice cracked with age but still strong. And then some of the Americans began to hum along, not knowing the words in German or Spanish, but recognizing something universal in the melody. Three languages, one song, the same gratitude expressed in different tongues, but meaning the same thing. We are alive. The harvest is good. We give thanks. By mid-afternoon, the formality had dissolved entirely. Someone produced a deck of cards and began teaching the German women to play poker using matches as chips, since gambling for money was against regulations. Mrs. Rose showed Maggie how to crimp the edges of a pie crust properly. Buck demonstrated the right way to wear a Stetson, setting it on Eva's head at a rakish angle that made everyone laugh. Stories flowed like wine, stories about farms and families, about first loves and embarrassing moments, about hopes for after the war, about simple, ordinary, beautiful human things that had nothing to do with politics or propaganda or whose side anyone was on. As the November sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple that Maggie had learned to love, she sat back in her chair and looked around the mess hall. At Anna laughing at something private Danny had said. At Eva dealing cards with increasing confidence. At Buck explaining something to another German woman using hand gestures and broken German that was more enthusiasm than accuracy. At Mrs. Rose moving from table to table like a benevolent general surveying her troops, making sure everyone had enough that no one felt left out. This was what they had fought against. This warmth, this generosity, this simple human kindness. And she had believed the propaganda, had believed that Americans were weak and decadent and cruel, had believed that their values were lies. But you cannot fake this, she thought. You cannot manufacture this kind of genuine welcome. Either it is real or it is not. And this was as real as the pumpkin pie that still tasted sweet on her tongue, as real as the calluses on Buck's hands from honest work, as real as Mrs. Rose's grip when she had said it was okay to cry. As the feast finally wound down and the women prepared to return to their barracks, Mrs. Rose pressed small packages into their hands. Leftovers wrapped in cloth napkins, turkey and pie and rolls, small gifts to take with them. Evidence that this had really happened, that for 4 hours they had not been prisoners and guards. They had just been people sharing a meal. Buck caught Maggie's eye across the room. He touched the brim of his hat in that gesture she had come to recognize as his version of respect. She nodded back, not trusting herself to speak. Something had shifted between them. Something neither was ready to name, but both felt. The walk back to the barracks was quiet. The 28 women moved as a group, protective of each other, protective of what they had just experienced. The sun had set. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The temperature was dropping the way it does in the desert when the sun goes down. Captain Braun and the 19 women who had refused to attend waited in the barracks. They sat on their bunks in formation, backs straight, faces stony. Braun stood as the others entered. Well, her voice was cold as November wind. Did you enjoy your American propaganda feast? Maggie met her gaze steadily. She was surprised by her own calm, by the certainty in her voice when she spoke. I sat at a table with people who treated me with dignity, who shared their food and their stories, who cried with me over pie. If that is propaganda, Captain, then I do not understand loyalty the way I thought I did. Braun's jaw tightened. You betray everything we stand for, do we? Maggie asked quietly. What do we stand for now? Captain, Germany is being destroyed. Our families are dying. Our cities are rubble. What exactly are we being loyal to? A government that sent us to war? A Führer who cares nothing for whether we live or die? Or are we just clinging to orders because admitting we were wrong about everything is too terrifying to face? The barracks went silent. Even Braun seemed momentarily at a loss for words. The question hung in the air unanswered and unanswerable. The division in the camp deepened after Thanksgiving. The collaborators, as Braun's group called them, and the loyalists stopped speaking to each other except when absolutely necessary. Morning roll calls became tense affairs with the two groups deliberately standing apart. The mess hall divided along invisible lines. But something else was happening too. The women who had attended the feast worked with different energy. They volunteered for tasks without being asked. They helped maintain the barracks. Anna Klein began assisting in the camp infirmary, her nursing skills becoming invaluable to the overworked medical staff. They carried themselves differently, as if a weight had been lifted, as if they had remembered they were human beings with value beyond their usefulness as soldiers or prisoners. December arrived with cooler mornings and the promise of winter even in Texas. The work continued. The routines remained the same, but everything felt different, lighter, more hopeful. And then on a gray December morning, the mail truck arrived. The Red Cross had finally processed communications through proper channels. 23 letters arrived that cold December 8th. The driver handed them to Colonel Bennett, who personally distributed them during evening formation. Maggie's hands trembled when her name was called. The envelope was thin-creased from its long journey. German stamps, censorship marks, her aunt's handwriting on the front. She waited until evening to open it, until the others were sleeping or pretending to sleep. She sat on her bunk in the darkness, holding the letter like something that might explode. Outside, thunder rumbled. A winter storm was moving in rare for West Texas, but not impossible. She opened the envelope carefully, unfolded the single sheet of paper. Her aunt's handwriting was shakier than she remembered. The words swam before her eyes. She had to read them 3 times before they made sense, for her mind would accept what they said. Your mother was killed in an Allied bombing raid in July. The building collapsed. She died instantly and did not suffer. Your brother Friedrich is missing. Last seen during the defense of Berlin. We must assume the worst. The apartment building where you grew up no longer exists. Nothing was salvageable. There is nothing left here for you to return to Margaret. Everyone is gone. Everything is destroyed. If you can make a life elsewhere, do it. Do not come back to ghosts. The page blurred. Tears filled her eyes and spilled over, running hot down her cheeks. Lightning flashed outside the window, illuminating the barracks in stark white light. Thunder cracked loud enough to rattle the glass. Mother dead since July. 5 months Maggie had been walking around not knowing her mother was gone. 5 months of being an orphan without knowing it. Friedrich, her baby brother who wanted to be a doctor, who was afraid of thunder, who used to climb into her bed during storms when they were children. Missing, presumed dead, just 17 years old. Just a boy, home, the apartment where she grew up, where Christmas mornings happened, where her mother sang while sewing, where her father read the newspaper after dinner, where she had lived her entire life until the war. Gone, erased, as if it had never existed. The grief was a physical thing, crushing her chest, making it impossible to breathe. She tried to cry quietly, not to wake the others, but the sobs tore out of her throat like something with claws. Anna woke. She moved to Maggie's bunk without a word and wrapped her arms around her, just held her while she shook and wept and made sounds that were barely human. What do I go back to? Maggie whispered when she could speak again. Even if the war ends tomorrow, what is there? Anna's silence was its own answer. She had received her own letter 2 days earlier. Hamburg firestormed. Family missing. Nothing left. Maybe we don't go back, Anna said quietly. Maybe we go forward. It was the first time either of them had spoken the impossible thought aloud. The idea that had been growing since Thanksgiving. Since the bacon breakfast. Since Buck had taught Maggie about prickly pears and desert flowers. Since Mrs. Rose had held her hand and told her it was okay to cry. Maybe they did not have to return to the ruins of Germany. Maybe they could build something new in here. Maybe home was not a place you returned to, but a place you created from whatever pieces remained of your broken life. Outside, the storm raged. Lightning split the sky. Thunder shook the earth. And inside the barracks, 2 young women who had lost everything held each other and dared to imagine a future that did not involve going back to a past that no longer existed. The letters kept coming throughout December. Almost every woman received news. Almost all of it was devastating. Cities destroyed, family members dead or missing, homes reduced to rubble. The Germany they had believed they were fighting for was being systematically erased from the map. Even Captain Braun's certainty began to crack. Late January 1945. The coldest winter West Texas had seen in a decade. Snow dusted the desert landscape in a thin white veil that melted by mid-morning, but transformed the world while it lasted. The German women accustomed to Berlin winters found it almost comical. This was what Texans called cold, but they wrapped themselves in army-issue blankets anyway and watched the rare snow fall with something like wonder. The letters continued to arrive. Each mail delivery brought fresh grief, fresh confirmation that the world they had known was gone. By the end of January, 43 of the 47 women had received news from home. 41 reported family deaths or missing loved ones. 38 reported their homes destroyed. 0 had anything substantial left to return to. The numbers told a story more devastating than any individual letter could convey. An entire generation was being erased. Not just killed in battle, but systematically destroyed by a war that had consumed everything in its path. Maggie found herself counseling other women through their grief. Her role as translator had evolved into something closer to mediator and confidant. Women brought their letters to her, asking her to help them understand the careful language their relatives used to describe horrors too large for direct words. She sat with Eva Fisher while the young woman sobbed over news that her entire family had been killed in a single bombing raid. Sat with another woman who learned her husband had been executed for desertion. Sat with a third who discovered her children had been sent to an orphanage, and she had no idea if they were still alive. The grief was an ocean, endless, all-consuming, and Maggie was drowning in it along with everyone else. Late one evening, as Maggie sat on her bunk trying to compose a response to her aunt's letter, Captain Helena Braun approached. She moved quietly without her usual military precision. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "May I sit?" Maggie looked up in surprise. Braun had not spoken to her directly since Thanksgiving, had barely acknowledged her existence. Now she stood there with all her military bearing, gone, looking older than her 38 years, looking broken. "Of course, Captain." Braun sat heavily on the bunk. For a long moment she said nothing, just stared at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, the words came slowly, painfully, like something being extracted from deep inside. "My husband was killed at Stalingrad. They just now told me. 2 years I did not know. 2 years I believed he was coming home. 2 years of telling myself that if I stayed loyal, if I followed orders, if I remained strong, he would return and everything would be as it was." Her voice cracked. Tears ran down her weathered face, carving tracks through skin that had not cried in decades. "But he has been dead for 2 years, and Germany is dying. And I have been clinging to orders because I was afraid. Afraid that if I let go of Germany, I would have nothing left. But Germany is already gone, and is it not?" Maggie set down her pen. She reached out slowly and took Braun's hand. The older woman's fingers were cold and trembling. "Not gone, Captain. Changed. We are changed. Maybe that is not the same as gone." Braun looked at her with eyes that had seen too much and understood too late. "I was wrong, Schneider, about the feast, about the Americans, about you, about everything. I clung to certainty because doubt was terrifying. But the certainty was a lie. And now I have nothing. You have yourself," Maggie said quietly. "That is more than many people have. And perhaps that is enough to build something new from." That night marked a turning point. The divisions in the barracks began to dissolve. Women who had refused to speak to each other started sitting together during meals. Braun's supporters, seeing their leaders break down, began to question their own rigid positions. The camp did not become unified overnight, but the sharp edges of conflict began to soften under the weight of shared grief. They were all just women who had lost everything. And in that loss, they found a strange equality. February arrived with warmer days and a restlessness that settled over the camp like dust. The war news from Europe was unmistakably moving toward Germany's defeat. Soviet forces were pushing from the east, Allied forces from the west. It was no longer a question of whether Germany would lose, but when. Colonel Bennett received orders to prepare for repatriation procedures once hostilities ceased. Ships would be made ready. The women would be processed through displaced persons camps and released to whatever remained of their former lives. The news should have brought relief. Instead, it created anxiety that hummed through the barracks like electricity. One afternoon in mid-February, Maggie was working in the equipment shed with Buck translating supply lists and updating inventory records. The work was routine, comfortable. They had developed an easy rhythm over the months away of working together that required few words but accomplished much. Buck set down his clipboard. He looked at Maggie with an expression she could not quite read. "You ever think about what happens after the war?" The question caught her off guard. She stopped writing mid-word. "I try not to. Thinking about it hurts." Buck nodded slowly. He picked up a length of rope and began coiling it with the automatic precision of someone who had done the task 10,000 times. "What if you did not go back?" Silence. Maggie's pen hovered over the paper. She could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the wind outside, could hear the entire world holding its breath. "What do you mean?" Buck continued coiling the rope, not meeting her eyes. His voice was careful, measured, like a man walking across ice that might crack at any moment. "War is going to end. America takes in refugees sometimes, people who have nowhere else to go. Just wondering if you ever considered staying." The proposition hung in the air between them. Impossible, unthinkable. And yet the moment he said it, Maggie realized she had been thinking about it for weeks, maybe months, maybe since that first Sunday breakfast when bacon tasted like hope. Is that even possible? Buck finally looked at her. His weathered face was serious, but not unkind. "Do not know. But I have learned that lots of impossible things turn out to be possible if folks want them bad enough. My family has got a ranch. Could use someone who speaks both English and Spanish, especially with all the Mexican workers we will be hiring post-war. It is honest work, honest pay, and it is a future." The unspoken words were louder than what he said. They both heard them. Both felt the weight of what was not being said, the growing connection between them that neither had named, the possibility of something more than employer and employee, guard and prisoner, cowboy and German woman. "I will think on it," Maggie managed. That night she lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep. Anna and Eva were awake too. She could tell by their breathing. Finally Eva spoke into the darkness. "If we could stay, start over, be something other than defeated enemy soldiers." "My whole family is gone," Anna added. "What am I returning to rubble and ghosts?" Maggie stared at the ceiling. "The Germany we knew does not exist anymore. Maybe we build something new. Here, maybe going forward is not betrayal. Maybe it is survival." The whispered conversation continued for hours. Three young women imagining the impossible, daring to hope for a future that did not involve returning to the ruins of their past. By morning, they had not made a decision, but the seed had been planted, and seeds given the right conditions have a way of growing into things you never imagined possible. May 8th, 1945. The radio crackled with static, then cleared. The announcer's voice was professional, but could not quite hide the excitement underneath. "Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe is over." 53 people sat in the mess hall listening to the broadcast, Americans and Germans together. The moment should have been triumphant. For the Americans, perhaps it was, though even their celebration was muted by exhaustion and the knowledge that war still raged in the Pacific. For the German women, it felt like attending their own funeral. The war they had been fighting, whether they believed in it or not, was over. The government they had served, corrupt and evil as it was, had collapsed. The country they called home existed now only in memory and rubble. Everything they had known, everything they had been, was finished. Colonel Bennett stood before them. His face was grave. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of unwelcome duty. "Repatriation procedures will begin within weeks. Ships are being prepared to transport prisoners of war back to Europe. You will be processed through displaced persons camps and released to whatever remains of your former lives. I know this is not easy news. For many of you, there is little to return to. But those are our orders." He paused, looked around the room at faces he had come to know over 9 months. Women who had worked his ranch, who had eaten at his table, who had become, against all regulations and common sense, something more than just prisoners. "If anyone has questions, I will do my best to answer them." Silence, heavy as lead. No one spoke. No one seemed able to form words adequate to the moment. Then Maggie stood. Her legs felt unsteady. Her heart hammered. Every eye in the room turned toward her. She could feel Anna's hand gripping her skirt, trying to pull her back down. Could feel Eva's sharp intake of breath. Could feel the weight of what she was about to do. She spoke in English, clearly, loudly enough for everyone to hear. Colonel Bennett, is it possible for a prisoner to request asylum in America? Not as prisoner, as immigrant, as refugee. The room froze. The question hung there like smoke, visible and impossible to ignore. Before Bennett could respond, Anna stood beside Maggie, then Eva. Then three more women, six in total, standing together asking for the impossible. Captain Braun rose from her seat at the back of the room. Her face was unreadable. You would abandon Germany, your homeland. Maggie turned to face her. When she spoke, her voice was steady. The words had been forming in her mind for weeks. Now they poured out with the force of long, suppressed truth. Captain Germany abandoned us first. My mother is dead. My brother is gone. My home is rubble. I am not abandoning Germany. Germany was taken from me by a war that none of us chose. She took a breath. The room was so silent she could hear the clock ticking on the wall. I choose to honor my mother by living, by building something from what remains. I choose to believe that her death was not meaningless if I can make a life that means something. The Germany I loved is gone, but maybe I can build something good here, something that would have made her proud. That is not betrayal, that is survival. The silence stretched. Then Buck stood. He removed his hat and held it over his heart. My family's ranch will sponsor Miss Schneider. I will stake my reputation on it. Mrs. Rose Martinez stood next. I will sponsor Anna Klein. Anyone who can cook like her deserves a chance. Private Danny O'Brien pulled a letter from his pocket. My family in Boston will sponsor Eva Fisher. Already wrote them. They said yes. One by one, Americans stood offering sponsorship, offering employment, offering a chance at a future for women who had been their enemies 9 months ago and had become something else entirely. Braun watched it all with tears streaming down her weathered face. When the offers finally stopped, she spoke. I will return to Germany. I must see if my family survived. I must try to rebuild what was destroyed. But you, she looked at Maggie, you were right. About everything. Live. Build something good. Make her proud. She crossed the room and embraced Maggie. Two German women, one choosing to return to ghosts, one choosing to build a new life. Both choices valid. Both choices born of love and loss and the desperate human need to find meaning in the ruins. The process was complicated and unprecedented. Letters flew back and forth to Washington. The War Department had procedures for repatriation, but none for enemy prisoners requesting asylum. Local sponsors were found, employment was secured, character references were provided by Colonel Bennett Buck, Mrs. Rose, and half a dozen others. In June, 41 women boarded ships bound for Europe. There were tears at their departure, embraces, promises to write. They were not enemies anymore, not exactly friends, but something in between. Women who had shared an experience that none of them would ever forget. 6 women stayed. Maggie, Anna, Eva, and 3 others whose stories were their own, but equally worthy of telling. The division was not bitter. Some people needed to return home, no matter what they would find there. Some people needed to go forward into something new. Both choices required courage. Both choices honored the dead in different ways. Mrs. Rose packed food for those departing. Buck helped load their meager belongings onto the trucks. Colonel Bennett shook each woman's hand and wished them well. They carried letters from American soldiers to German civilians. Small gestures of reconciliation in a shattered land. As the trucks pulled away, Maggie stood with Anna and Eva watching the dust rise in their wake. She felt Buck come to stand beside her, did not look at him. Just felt his solid presence, his quiet strength. No regrets, he asked quietly. Only that I did not say yes to that first invitation sooner. 20 years is a long time. Long enough for wounds to scar. Long enough for enemies to become family. Long enough for impossible things to become just life. November 1965. Maggie Calloway stood in the ranch dining room now, 44 years old, watching the November sun paint the Texas sky in familiar shades of orange and purple. The same room where 20 years earlier she had tasted pumpkin pie and cried over the impossibility of kindness. She had married Buck in 1950, a quiet ceremony with Mrs. Rose cooking the reception dinner and Colonel Bennett, now retired, giving her away. They had two children who ran wild across the same desert that had once seemed so alien and hostile. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Maggie's ability to speak English, German, and Spanish made her invaluable as they hired more immigrant workers. She was respected in the community now, an American citizen, a ranch owner, a mother, a woman who had built a life from ashes. Today was the reunion, the same tables covered with white cloths, the same fall decorations, the same impossible abundance of food. Mrs. Rose, now 84 and moving slowly but still commanding her kitchen like a general, had been cooking for days. Anna arrived first with her husband, former Lieutenant Morrison, and their three children. She ran the nursing program at the county hospital now. Saved lives daily had become the kind of American success story that made politicians give speeches about immigration and opportunity. Iva came from California, where she taught German literature at a university. Her husband, that same Private Danny O'Brien, who had cried over his mother's burned turkey, traveled with her. They had four children between them. The other three women who had stayed came with their families, husbands, children, grandchildren in some cases. An entire generation born from the choice six women had made 20 years ago. And then, to everyone's surprise, Captain Helena Braun arrived. She was 58 now, silver-haired, softer than she had been, but still carrying herself with quiet dignity. She had rebuilt a life in Hamburg after the war, spent 20 years working with war orphans, had written asking if she might attend this reunion, this gathering of the women she had once called traitors. Maggie embraced her at the door, held her tight. Two women who had once stood on opposite sides of an impossible choice, united now by the years in the memory of shared grief. The tables filled. The original 28 who had attended that first feast, or as many as could make it, American staff still alive, next generation children running between tables. A beautiful chaos of English and German and Spanish being spoken simultaneously. Buck carved the turkeys with the same steady hands that had taught Maggie about prickly pears and desert flowers. Mrs. Rose moved from table to table with her slow, stately pace, making sure everyone had enough. Colonel Bennett, now 70, sat at the head table looking deeply satisfied. Before the meal began, Maggie stood to speak. The room fell silent. Even the children sensed the importance of the moment. 20 years ago, she began her English flawless now, but still carrying the faint ghost of a German accent. 28 scared women walked through those doors. We had been told that Americans were cruel, that your food was poison, that your kindness was weakness. We believed it, because believing was easier than questioning. She paused, looked around the room at faces old and new. One meal changed everything. Because you, she gestured to Buck, to Mrs. Rose, to Bennett, to the others, you chose to see us as human beings first and enemies second. You fed us. You welcomed us. You showed us that everything we had been taught was a lie. That feast taught me that even in the darkest times we can choose. Choose kindness over cruelty. Choose future over past. Choose life over death. Her voice grew stronger. I am grateful for the country that took me in. For the cowboy who taught me that the desert is not hostile, just misunderstood. For bacon, she smiled, and there was laughter. Dear God, for bacon, for pumpkin pie, for second chance, but most of all for proving that even in war, humanity can win. Mrs. Rose stood, her small frame still commanding attention. My grandfather said, you measure a people by how they treat strangers at their table. You all measured well, both sides. The meal began. The food was exactly as Maggie remembered. Turkey tender and juicy, stuffing savory and perfect, pies sweet and spiced and capable of making grown women cry. The same recipes Mrs. Rose had used 20 years ago. The same abundance. The same message. You are welcome here. After dinner, as the November sun sank toward the horizon, Maggie stood at the wall where two photographs hung side by side. The first was from 1944, 28 young women in faded gray uniforms standing outside the mess hall on Thanksgiving night. Rose had taken it with an old Kodak camera. Their faces showed nervousness, hope, fear, wonder, all mixed together. They looked impossibly young, impossibly vulnerable. The second was from today. The same women 20 years older. Gray hair among them now, laugh lines and age spots. American clothes instead of prison uniforms. Children at their feet, husbands beside them, smiling like they meant it, smiling like they had earned the right to smile. Buck came to stand beside her. He looked at the photographs for a long moment. No regrets. She leaned against him, felt his arm come around her shoulders, watched through the window as their children played in the desert sunset. Only that we did not have more years. Only that my mother never got to taste Mrs. Rose's pumpkin pie. Only that my brother never got to see that being kind is stronger than being right. They stood there as the sun set and the stars began to appear. The same stars that hung over Berlin and Texas and every other place on earth. The same stars that had watched humanity tear itself apart in war and somehow impossibly begin to knit itself back together in peace. 41 women had returned to Europe in 1945. 6 had stayed. Those 6 had built lives that mattered, had raised children who knew nothing of war, had proven that enemies can become family, that propaganda can be defeated by a single act of genuine kindness, that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a gun or a bomb, but a plate of bacon in the simple words, "Welcome to our table." Maggie Calloway lived to be 91 years old. She never returned to Germany. She said Texas was home. Her children and grandchildren still run the ranch, still serve Thanksgiving dinner with the same recipes Mrs. Rose taught them, still tell the story of the feast that changed everything, still hang those 2 photographs side by side as a reminder. Because sometimes history is not made by generals or politicians or great battles. Sometimes it is made by a Mexican-American cook who believed food builds bridges, by a Texas cowboy who saw scared kids instead of enemies, by a German woman who had the courage to say yes to an impossible kindness, by ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply because it was the right thing to do. War tries to make us forget we are human. It builds walls, creates categories, draws lines between us and them. It teaches us to hate people we have never met, to fear people we do not understand, to see enemies instead of just people. But kindness remembers. Kindness breaks down walls. Kindness crosses lines. Kindness says there is no them, only us, only people trying to survive, trying to make sense of a world that has gone mad, trying to find their way home. And sometimes home is not a place you return to. Sometimes it is a place you build from whatever remains of your broken life. Sometimes it is a table where strangers become family. Sometimes it is a piece of pumpkin pie that tastes like hope. The feast at Fort Stockton in 1944 lasted 4 hours. Its effects lasted lifetimes. If this story moved you, share it, especially with those who served during World War II or who remember what America can be at its best. Share it with those who need to be reminded that kindness is not weakness, that generosity is not foolishness, that seeing humanity in your enemy is not betrayal, but the truest form of courage. Leave your stories in the comments. Did you or your family serve during this time? Did you ever encounter former enemy soldiers who became friends? How has your family celebrated Thanksgiving over the years? These stories matter. They are the bridges that connect us across time and distance, and all the things that try to divide us. And remember, in a world that often feels dark and divided, you have the power to extend an invitation, to welcome a stranger, to choose kindness when cruelty would be easier, to see the human being first and everything else second. That is what America means, not flags or slogans or political speeches, but the simple act of making room at your table for someone who needs a place to belong. Maggie Schneider walked into that mess hall in 1944 expecting a trap. She found a family. What will you choose? Who will you welcome? What impossible kindness will you dare to offer? The table is set. The invitation is extended. All you have to do is say yes.